Oh, looks like we're live. Good day to you on this Easter Monday. And we are on to the second half of the syntax unit in Achmadian's text. And you'll be glad to know that this is really the end of the theoretical portion of the course. And I know particularly the second half of the syntax chapter looks and sounds formidable, but I'm here to tell you right now it's simple, it's easy, and I'm going to talk you through the concepts of the second half, beginning on page 175. Now, the first half of this chapter was really devoted to showing you how you can break a sentence up into phrases. So it isn't that, for instance, the sentence in 3.5.1 on page 170 is article, noun, preposition, article, noun, auxiliary verb, blah, 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 blah. It isn't just word, because it's overly complicated. Every sentence, as you were taught in middle school, is a subject and a predicate, or if you prefer, NP, VP, noun phrase, verb phrase. Now, our text takes the added approach of assuming that every sentence contains an auxiliary as well. So, I will eat. I is the subject, will is the auxiliary, and eat is the verb, or the verb phrase, if you like. Now, the second half of this chapter is really all about how those phrases can move. And when we move a phrase, well, ask the question, where can it go and where can't it go? The expectable and rules-based movement of a phrase is called a transformation. And we're going to be using the word transformation a few times in the second half of this chapter and in today's lecture. Although we are going to use movement to test the phrasality of phrases. Now, the first thing we're going to do, page 175, is sorry, I'm just thinking here. Yeah. I'm going to ignore the first of the three tests that's mentioned under the section header on page 175. They're more interested in clefts and conjunctions. We can use rules to test for phrasality, but all I'm interested in is the clefts and the conjunctions. So I'm going to jump ahead to page, well, at the very least I'll talk about the rules just for a second. Now, page 170, tree 5.1, this is that formidable looking tree diagram at the bottom of page 170. Now, as the text says halfway down page 175, we have good reasons for supposing that the phrase "the people in the room forms a single NP constituent and is not merely an unstructured string of words. Now, if you go to the tree diagram on page 170, you'll see that the tree diagram labels this group of words as a noun phrase. All you have to do is go up to the S at the top. You'll see there are only three branches off that S. One of them is NP, the people in the room. Now, beyond that, we're going to argue that the NP to the left of the VP is always going to be the grammatical subject of the sentence. Now remember, I keep having to say this, subject isn't what the sentence is about in a grammatical context. It's the doer of the action. So the NP to the left of the VP in the tree diagram on page 170 is the people in the room. We're just going to argue that that is the subject. Now, what about the object? You've been told by your middle school teacher that every sentence consists of a subject and a predicate. Now, common sense will tell you there's a verb in every predicate. You can't have a sentence without an action. But in a sentence like John sleeps, it should be obvious to you there's no object. There's just a verb in the verb phrase and that's that. But what about John kicks the cat? Is the cat independent of the verb phrase or is it part of the verb phrase? I'm going to argue that it's part of the verb phrase. And that's part and parcel of the definition of object. The object is the noun phrase within the verb phrase. So if you again go back to page 170, look at the tree diagram, we've already posited that the NP at the start is the subject. We'll ignore the auxiliary. We'll go on to the VP. Is there a noun phrase in that verb phrase? In fact, there is, the desk. We're going to argue that that's the object because it's the noun phrase within the verb phrase. Okay, now, cleft sentences. A cleft sentence is always a sentence that begins with it or something similar. You can say what as well. You've probably heard of what clefts. What makes me angry is. However, we're more interested in cleft sentences using it. It was the burglar who broke the lamp. It was Mary whom I went to meet. It was under the mattress we found the money. Now, if you go 1/3 of the way down page 176, you'll see an example of a cleft sentence. It was X that Y, or it is X that Y. Now, X stands for an entire noun phrase or sometimes a prepositional phrase as well. So if we again go back to that sentence at the bottom of page 170, we can put the people in the room into the X position. We can put the desk into the X position. We can put into the hall into the X position. We might even be able to put the hall in there as well. We'll try that in a moment. I'm flying by the seat of my pants here. But let's try cleft sentences with those quantities. The people in the room will move the desk into the hall. It was the people in the room who moved the desk into the hall, or it is the people in the room who will move the desk into the hall. Okay. How about the desk? It is the desk that the people will move into the hall. How about into the hall? It is into the hall that the people in the room will move the desk. Now, the point is that the X position there can't be taken by any random string of words. So if I take, for instance, desk into, it isn't going to work. It is desk into the people in the room will move the hall. It makes no sense. Let's take another random string of words from that sentence. Room will move. It is room will move that the people, the desk, the hall, again, it fails. The point is that the only thing you can put into X there is an entire phrase, not just any random string of words, but an entire phrase. It might be the people in the room, it might be the desk, or it might be into the hall. Now I'm going to see if I can do the hall. I don't know, this may or may not fail, we'll see. It was the hall into which the people in the room moved the desk. It works. It's awkward, but it works. Okay. So the exposition can be filled by any noun phrase or prepositional phrase. So making cleft sentences demonstrates to us that words move as phrases, as standalone groups of words, not just as random strings of words. Some strings in that sentence will work, others will not. They have to be noun phrases or prepositional phrases. Okay, now, conjunction. At the bottom of page 177. Conjunction kind of proves groups or groups of words or phrase quantities as well. Take a look at the examples at the bottom of page 177. The teacher and the student argued. Now the and is a conjunction, but you can only put two quantities each side of the conjunction that are exactly balanced. And in that case, it's noun phrase, noun phrase. Sentence B, Mary played the harmonica and danced the jig. In this case, it's verb phrase, verb phrase. The third example there, we moved the desk through the door and into the hall. Prepositional phrase, prepositional phrase. But take a look at sentences C and D, 1/3 of the way down, page 178. Mary played the harmonica and into the night. Now it should work because sentence A and sentence B work. The reason it does not work is because the harmonica is a noun phrase and into the night is a prepositional phrase. You cannot balance those two with a conjunction because they're not the same quantity. They're not a noun phrase and a noun phrase, or a prepositional phrase and a prepositional phrase. Okay. The text mentions the ongoing argument about where to put the auxiliary category. I'm not going to throw myself into that argument, except to say that I mostly agree with the text's proposal to put the auxiliary category as a direct constituent of S or sentence rather than making it part of the verb phrase. But there are plenty of syntacticians who will argue the opposite, that auxiliary is part of the verb phrase and may even provide persuasive evidence. So I'm just going to say that happens. Now, grammatical relations. We're back to what we were talking about at the start of this discussion on page 175. What roles do phrases play in sentences? So we're going one step above the word level. We're looking at groups of words as phrases and trying to see what roles they play. And by roles, I mean things like subject and object. And all the text is really doing between 179 and 181 is saying what I was saying about 5 minutes ago, that the noun phrase to the left of the verb phrase in a tree diagram is always the subject, the doer of the action, if there's an action, and the noun phrase within the verb phrase is the object. Now, obviously, in complicated sentences, that isn't going to be so obvious, but let's take a look at the two very simple tree diagrams on page 180. Here we have an S sentence consisting of a noun phrase, verb phrase. The people in the room is the noun phrase, and the verb phrase is frightened the boy. Now, what is the noun phrase to the left of the verb phrase? It's the people in the room, the subject. What is the noun phrase within the verb phrase? It's the boy. That's the object. Simple as that. Now, if we reverse the order of those phrases, the boy frightened the people in the room, you'll see that the roles that those noun phrases are playing in the sentence have radically changed. The boy is now the doer of the action, and the people in the room are the receiver of the action. So the boy is the subject, the people in the room are the object. Now, let's get back to a sentence we discussed last week. The mother of the boy and the girl will arrive soon. This was the second sentence, the second example sentence of the whole chapter, in fact. Now, this is an ambiguous sentence because we could be referring to one person, that is to say, the mother of the boy and the girl. Or it could be referring to two people, the mother of the boy and the girl. As the order of the words stands, if you look at those words in a string or in a row, it's impossible for us to tell what the speaker is intending. However, could we diagram, or perhaps could the speaker diagram that sentence? Take a look at the top of page 182. In this case, we get two tree diagrams. One demonstrating the sentence as if the speaker is imagining a single person arriving soon, the mother of the boy and the girl. And you can see that the noun phrase consists of an article, the, noun, mother, and a prepositional phrase consisting of the boy and the girl. By the way, as the text points out, we could expand that prepositional phrase, but we don't particularly want to because it'll take up a lot of space on the page. We're happy that we understand that phrase, so we just draw a triangle under PP. We could expand it, we're just choosing not to. Same thing with the VP, by the way. You'll see arrive soon is indicated with a triangle. Now, the other way of diagramming this sentence, if the speaker is imagining two people coming, is by suggesting that the noun phrase consists internally of two noun phrases, each separated by the conjunction and. So you get the mother of the boy, noun phrase number one. You'll see that it contains its own little prepositional phrase of the boy. We're not going to expand that. The conjunction and another noun phrase, the girl, because remember, two noun phrases have to be balanced by a conjunction. And then the rest of the sentence, exactly as above, will arrive soon. So the point here really is that it is possible to resolve ambiguities using tree diagrams. If you leave the sentence as a string of words, it's impossible to resolve the ambiguity. Of course, tree diagrams only exist on paper. When you have a speaker and a listener, the listener isn't necessarily going to understand what the speaker means because the speaker can't speak in tree diagrams. But at the very least, it explains what's going on in the speaker's mind. Okay, at the bottom of page 182, discontinuous dependencies. Now, what the text is really trying to do here is to throw you a curveball. The text is saying, we've been working with these phrase groups and they cannot be broken up. You have to move them around the sentence in groups. But we have learned through analyzing sentences that in fact it is sometimes possible to break up an apparent group of words into more than one group, but it can only be done in a very specific way. And I don't think this damages our belief that we need to look at sentences as phrases. Now, two-thirds of the way down page 182, you get two sentences. Mary stood up her date. Mary stood her date up. Now, both sentences mean exactly the same thing. But interestingly, the up can move, can jump over the noun phrase and end up at the end of the sentence. Same thing with the other sentences. The chef added in the ingredients, the chef added the ingredients in. Now, people had problems with these small words. We're going to call them particles for years because they look like prepositions. After all, the cat ran up the wall. The man stood in the house. The child fell down the well. These are obviously prepositions, and yet all three of those are being used in a non-prepositional way on page 182 with sentence 52A and B, 53A and B, and 54A and B. What's going on? Well, what I'm going to argue, the text doesn't quite go so far as to say this, but I'm going to say this. These are originally prepositions that got attached to verbs, and then the verb plus the preposition developed a new meaning. Now, that means if you take the preposition, which we're going to call a particle now, away, the intrinsic meaning is lost. So you will hopefully agree with me that the verb in John stood up is not the same as the verb in Mary stood up her date. Hopefully you agree with me. In the first case, John is simply standing up. We have a sort of a preposition there. In the second case, to stand somebody up is a special use of the verb to stand with a particle, and it means not to show up for a promised encounter. The interesting point that the text is making, however, is that the particle, apparently part of the verb phrase, can be taken out of the verb phrase and put to the very end of the sentence. They batted around some new ideas, bottom of page 182. They batted some new ideas around. Now, what do we do with this particle? How do we label it? And do we treat it as part of the verb phrase? Let's jump to page 184 quickly. And you'll see that there are two tree diagrams. There's the first tree diagram, Mary stood up her date, and the second tree diagram, Mary stood her date up. Both sentences mean exactly the same thing, but look as if they have different structures. Now, the text pussyfoots around here, but what it's really saying, well, actually, here's where I'm going to jump outside the text for a second and remind you, have you ever had the experience of thinking of a sentence and then saying something, but the words haven't come out in the right order? I'm sure you have, particularly when you're tired. And that suggests that there is an intended structure in your mind, and sometimes the brain fails to process it properly, and it comes out with a faulty structure. We're going to call that structure the surface structure, and it isn't always going to be faulty, obviously. But what we're going to suggest is that the sentence at the top of page 184 is the imagined sentence. Now, in the old days of syntactic theory, this would have been called deep structure. It's how your mind imagines the sentence before it alters the words around. And often, if it's a simple sentence, the deep structure of a sentence and the sentence that gets spoken are the same. But sometimes a transformation occurs. And that's what's going on halfway down page 184. Mary stood her date up. There's been a transformation. And I'm going to argue that the base structure of this sentence is the tree in 5.9, and the altered surface structure of the sentence is tree 5.10. Mary stood her date up, where the particle has moved to the end. Now, all this means, as the text points out, in the text on page 184, is we have a discontinuous dependency. These words hang together anyway, but you can sometimes take a part of the phrase and move it somewhere else in the sentence. Now, this doesn't happen with particles only. Let's look at page 185. Several people who were wearing hats came in. I'm going to argue that that's the base or the deep structure. But we can say that in another way. We can also say several people came in who were wearing hats. Now, you'll agree with me that relative phrases like who were wearing hats usually attach intimately to the noun phrase immediately preceding. Several people who were wearing hats. And in fact, you cannot put that who were wearing hats too far away. So for instance, let's think of a long sentence and put the who were wearing hats at the end and see how it works. Several people, after the party had ended and the food had been put away, came home, who were wearing hats. You'll agree that who were wearing hats is too far away. It's lost its connection to the several people. However, with short sentences, like the example we have on page 185, there's a certain tolerance for allowing relative clauses like that to move over the verb phrase. It should not be allowable. We have argued that phrases stick together and they move as blocks. And yet now all of a sudden we're arguing that certain phrases in certain cases can indeed break into two, and one half of the phrase can jump over something else. And that's exactly what we see in tree 512 there on page 185. Several people came in who were wearing hats. The who were wearing hats is clearly referring to the several people rather than came in. All right. I hope you followed along, and I hope you agree that there isn't anything particularly complicated about those two specific examples of discontinuous dependency. You can move particles to the end of the sentence. You can move relative clauses over the verb phrase. And you have to remember, you can't move these too far away from each other, because otherwise the connection between them gets lost. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself here. The text introduces a phrase here, a term here, phrase markers, which was new to me as well, actually. All it means is tree diagram or syntactic diagram. So the two diagrams you see in page 189 are phrase markers, according to our text. What we want to do now is somehow at least write a rule to explain how those particles can move, like the Mary stood up her date, Mary stood her date up. And we're going to posit the rule almost at the bottom of page 166. Given a verb plus particle construction, the particle may be shifted away from the verb, moved immediately to the right of the object, noun, phrase, and attached to the verb phrase node. Node, by the way, is just where two lines meet in a tree diagram. So you can see, if you look at the base structure or the deep structure, what we're going to call the input tree, which sounds grand, but all of it just means how the brain is imagining the sentence. Mary stood up her date. The verb and the particle stick together as part of the verb. We, according to that particle movement rule that we've just posited, can take that particle out of the verb, jump it over the noun phrase, and now attach it to the verb phrase rather than the V that it was originally attached to. Fine. It was at this point I was just thinking about this. Is the particle behaving a little bit like an adverb? Because you remember when we were speaking about adverbs several weeks ago, we pointed out that adverbs can jump around. Now, particles can't really jump around, they can only jump to the end of the sentence. But there might be a tiny amount of adverbiality there. Could be. Okay. We're going to do the same thing with the process that we used to move the who were wearing hats to the end of the sentence. So we're going to argue that the tree diagram at the top of page 190 is the base sentence, how we imagine the sentence. And the tree diagram immediately beneath it is the way it might come out if we want to move the relative clause. Several people who were wearing hats came in. Let's move that relative clause. Several people came in who were wearing hats. Well, the same thing has happened. You'll see that who were wearing hats is originally part of the noun phrase. The text is suggesting at surface, structure, level, the who were wearing hats jumps out of the noun phrase and now becomes part, immediately, directly part of the sentence. It becomes a third branch on the S node. Fair enough, let's accept that. Now, we have those two rules. Can we combine them? I'm going to argue we can. Let's take a sentence. Let's see, there it is. Sentence number 69, 1/3 of the way down, page 192. She stood up all those men who had offered her diamonds. See, there's a particle, up, and there's a relative clause, who had offered her diamonds. Can we apply both particle movement and extraposition? Well, let's see. Let's see what we can do with the particle first. So we'll claim that the tree diagram at the top of page 193 is the base form of the sentence. Now let's move that particle. So it was, she stood up all those men who had blah, blah, blah. She stood all those men who had offered her diamonds up. Bit awkward, the up is a long way away, but I think you can understand the sentence. She stood all those men who had offered her diamonds up. Now, This is actually a process that Germans do a great deal in German. English isn't very tolerant of moving particles a long way, but it works. So we're going to accept that the particle movement works in that sentence. Can we move the relative clause as well? I think so. Let's give it a try. She stood all those men up who had offered her diamonds. It does work. In fact, it sounds even better now that we have the particle back closer to the verb. Now, regarding the tree diagrams, you'll note that the particle started out at the top of the page in the deep structure, the original structure, as part of the V node under VP. Now, we're going to need to move that particle out of that and make it part of the verb phrase, because that's part of the rule we've posited for particle movement. And that's exactly what we see in the second tree diagram. She stood all those men who had etc. up. Now the particle is part of the, is a direct particle part of the VP rather than just the V. Now, we have a relative clause in there, who had offered her diamonds. That has started out as part of the noun phrase within the verb phrase. So if you go to the top of the page, you'll see it there. She stood up all those men who had offered her diamonds. And the who had offered her diamonds is a direct branch on the NP node. Now, the extra position rule at the bottom of page 190 argues that we can move that relative clause out of the NP and make it a direct part of the VP. And indeed we can. She stood all those men up who had offered her diamonds. And the who had offered her diamonds is now part of the VP rather than part of the NP inside it. Right. Section 5.3, bottom of page 194. I have, for most of my syntax career, been dealing with phrase structure rules, PS rules, such as those you see on page 195. I know they look very mathematical, but all this means, A means, for instance, S consists of NP, auxiliary, VP. Sentence consists of a noun phrase, an auxiliary verb, and a verb phrase. Rule B there says noun phrase consists of an optional article, that's what the parentheses means, a noun, and an optional prepositional phrase. C there says a verb phrase consists of a verb and an optional noun phrase. And D, a prepositional phrase consists of a preposition and a noun phrase. Now, as the text points out, these rules have changed a little recently under the scrutiny, the closer scrutiny of syntacticians. But how the rules have changed is beyond the level of this class. We're going to be happy with these rules right now because they're simple and they explain most simple noun phrases, most simple sentences, most simple verb phrases, etc. So you'll see the tree diagram at the bottom of the page there is basically just a representation of the rule that we see in A, 1/3 of the way down the page 195. Now, page 196 is just an explanation of the vocabulary that gets used when drawing tree diagrams. A node is where lines meet. So at the top of page 196, we'd speak of the S node dominating an NP, an auxiliary verb, and a VP. Now, the NP dominates an article and a noun, etc. So anything directly above anything else, if there's a line between it and that other thing, is dominating it. If you have two lines joining at a node, the objects at the ends of each of those two lines are considered sisters. So if you look at the tree diagram again at the top of page 196, there's a single VP, and the V and the NP below that are considered sisters. The VP, by the way, is the mother of those two categories, and those two categories are also the daughters of VP. So if you like, you can imagine tree diagrams as family trees. And we always use the feminine words to refer to them: mother, daughter, sister, etc. So that's all that's going on page 196. Page 197 argues that when a human being learns a word, the human being doesn't just learn the word, the human being learns the category of that word. So when we learn a noun, we know that it's a noun as well as getting its meaning. Now, where does this leave us in terms of phrase structure? Well, we're going to argue that there are at least 4 phrase categories in English. Of course, these rules can change from language to language, but we're going to argue that there are noun phrases, that there are verb phrases, that there are prepositional phrases, and that there are adjective phrases. And each of these phrases can be formed according to very simple and very specific rules. And no surprise here, if you have a noun phrase, it's always going to be headed by a noun. If you have a verb phrase, what's that going to be headed by? A verb. You're absolutely right. The text moves towards arguing that there must be a really simple way of looking at phrases. And it argues then at the bottom of page 197 that we can take away the N and the V and the P in NP, VP, PP. And just add an X. XP stands for any phrase. And you can see there's a little XP rule at the bottom of page 197 there. XP consists of X and something else. All right. Now, I spoke about recursion in the last class, but I'm going to speak about it again today, because recursion is the secret sauce of syntax. We were arguing earlier that you can have sentences of infinite length in any language. How does that work? How can you have a sentence of infinite length? Well, because you can always, let's say you have an extremely long sentence, a sentence that somebody claims is the longest sentence in the English language. Well, isn't it possible to open that sentence with the introductory phrase, John said, and then add in that sentence? And isn't that lengthening that sentence by 2 words? And then, of course, you can say, Mary said that John said, and have the longest sentence in the world. So the point is, you can have Margaret said that Mary said that John said, blah, blah, blah. And you're starting to get the idea, I hope. You can put sentences within sentences within sentences. Now, that's what the tree diagram at the top of page 198 is more or less saying. This is just a tree diagram representation of the phrase, the house in the woods by the mountain near the river, etc. Now, I'm going to argue that that sentence consists of a noun phrase, the river, inside a prepositional phrase, near the river, which is inside a noun phrase, the mountain near the river, which is inside a prepositional phrase, by the mountain near the river, which is inside a noun phrase, the woods by the mountain near the river, and keep going right up at the top. So this is another reason you can have infinitely long sentences, because you can put phrases inside phrases. You can put a noun phrase inside a prepositional phrase inside a noun phrase. Now again, our brains are linguistically weak. You can only go maybe 6 to 8 levels in before your brain says, I can't nest any more phrases. I just can't do it. But theoretically, it could go on infinitely. Now, I've used the word transformation once or twice. And what I'm going to argue, go back a few pages here, specifically to page 193, where we had the base tree diagram at the top, changing to allow the possibility that we can move the particle to the end of the sentence, and changing again to allow for the possibility of moving the modifier phrase there, the relative clause, to the end of the sentence as well. In each case, a transformation has occurred. Using particular rules of word order, we have moved phrases from one point to another. Or in fact, in this case, we have kind of split phrases up, which is exceptional, but it's possible. But we have done this according to specific rules, and we're going to call that word movement transformation. Now, the top of page 199 is terribly complicated, but it isn't. What we have as an example here is a sentence. Yesterday, Mary stood up her boyfriend at the bar. Now, what we're really only concerned about in this is the verb particle noun phrase. Stood up her boyfriend. We're not interested in yesterday and Mary, and we're not interested in at the bar. It's just those 3 words in the middle. So that's what the 2, 3, and 4 are all about. 1 and 5 aren't going to move. 2 isn't going to move either, by the way. The particle, number 3, is going to move. It's going to move right after number 4. A simple sentence that had the basic structure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, after the transformation now has the structure 1, 2, 4, 3, 5. Simple as that. That's all a transformation is. You're moving words according to certain rules. I've no comment to make about the claim of the text at the 2/3 of the way down. We can provide independent evidence that the particle is attached under the VP and not, say, under the S. Because I think the text is, if you'll forgive my saying this, getting beyond itself. I don't think there's any need to prove that. However, it's basically just saying the same thing that we saw on page 189. Mary stood up her date. Mary stood her date up. The particle is staying within the verb phrase. It's not leaving the verb phrase. It's just moving from one part of the verb phrase to another part. And that's really all that's going on to the end of the section that we're reading on page 201. So again, those two tree diagrams on page 200 look ferociously complicated at the first sight, but it's basically just the implementation of what I explained to you was going on at the top of page 199. Particle, number 3, is going to jump over the NP, number 4. So if you look at the tree diagram, which is the base form of the sentence, the deep structure form, she will stand up her date. Up is number 3, and we're going to move that category over number 4, between number 4 and number 5. And it becomes the second tree diagram there, the surface structure. She will stand her date up. Simple as that. Okay, my phone is ringing, and who that might be. Probably a fake call, so I'm not going to answer that. And I'm going to say thank you for your attention, and hopefully I have made this second half of the syntax chapter a little more explicable. I think it's extremely simple, and all we're saying is that words move in blocks, phrases, and when they move around, they're moving around according to transformational rules. That's it. Simple as that. I'm going to end this stream.